frameworks between Latin America and Africa differ more than they look alike, at least for the time being. This is because the Latin American industrialized development is on average more advanced than that of Africa. Many Latin American countries have now relaxed the mandatory targets that African countries are still stipulating in their legal frameworks. Latin American countries have also evolved towards R&D and the construction of an international competitive supply chain. This is more the focus of the local content policies right now. And the additional focus is that government support is given for market-driven partnerships between companies and suppliers. A typical example is these mining companies led suppliers development programs in Brazil, Chile, or Peru, whereby suppliers are invited to offer innovative solutions to the recurrent problems of the mining sector. And the most successful ones are then offered to serve the international network of subsidiaries of those mining firms. Africa has a lot of hard and mandatory targets on local content, but they have recently changed their focus in the last 5 to 6 years. They have changed their focus, shifting from an emphasis on local ownership to a focus on local value added, which is a very important move. And famous authors and development economists like Morris have said that a focus on local ownership only contributes to the localization of the import function. In my opinion, but I think the field will agree, successful local content frameworks are characterized by 6 aspects. The first one, local content has to be part of a wider vision and strategy of value-added creation and competitiveness. This strategy should lead to a clear and coherent legal framework around local content. For instance, import duties, they are often waived for foreign companies, but they are not waived for locals. Or they are waived for foreign companies on goods that could be produced locally. So all of this discourages local producers and local production. The second aspect, the process of local content policy formulation and monitoring, not to forget monitoring, has to be transparent and backed by strong, accountable, and really often dedicated institutions. 3, there should be realism in the setting of local content targets. Those targets should be grounded in the sector's procurement needs as well as in the analysis of the local capabilities. And these targets should be modified as conditions change over time. 4, there should be a gradual phasing in of local content policies to allow for industrial development and gradual scale-up of capacities. 5, there should also be a gradual phasing out of local content policies to avoid the entrenchment of special interests that prosper only thanks to regulatory barriers created by local content policies. And 6, the domestic economic constraints should be addressed. The local suppliers' constraints, the lack of infrastructure, lack of access to finance, the lack of access to technological support, and lack of access to information. All of this need to be addressed by the governments primarily, but in collaboration with the companies. The government should also prioritize support to innovation, R&D, and development of capabilities. And I think measuring the effectiveness of local content legal framework is not, or just policy, is not an easy task, given that they are often part of a large spectrum of economic policies. And moreover, as I just mentioned in the previous question, their impact also depends on some preconditions or enabling factors that relate to the domestic economy constraints. However, we can say that throughout history, the case studies have shown that local content policies have a trigger effect, in particular in countries with weak industrial bases.
I would say that local content, if defined as a national level local content, meaning that workers should be nationals from that country, though not necessarily from that locality, and meaning that goods and services should be provided by the national economy and not necessarily from the regional or local economies, I think it's in general term a good idea. Now, the concrete experience says that such an attempt has only been made partially and only in some countries. In Bolivia, for example, there are provisions that establish that companies in the hydrocarbon sector have to employ a certain percentage of Bolivian nationals. In Colombia, there is legislation that says the same about laborers, no? In local in mining and oil operations that need to be from the locality where the activity happens to take place. In Brazil, the experience is much more ambitious because the focus is not on labor but on the provision of goods and services. So, for example, when Presal came about, the established policy was that I think up to 60% of all goods and services to be consumed by the productive processes, the extraction and the processing of oil for the internal market or for exports, needed to be provided by Brazilian companies or companies established and actually operating in Brazil. No? But then you also have a number of other countries that have no provisions whatsoever. For example, in Peru, that's a field that is completely unregulated. Even in Colombia and in Bolivia, you have regulations pertaining labor, but you don't have any regulation regarding goods and services provided to these industries. No? So it is not that there is a lot of experience. It is not that you have a wide array of countries and situations in which different policies have been implemented, and then therefore you have a lot of material to evaluate and to extract conclusions. Now, you can also even say that you have countries in which you have had like de facto local country strategies implemented by the companies themselves or responded to market impulses that were not planned for or were not the result of a planned policy, which is the case of Chile, no? The whole development of a service industry around the mining compounds in northern Chile is not something that is established by the law. It's something that ended up being convenient for the mining companies, no? And it is also because you had investors in Chile that were willing to explore that field of opportunity and effectively to develop capacities to provide that kind of goods and services. No? So the experience is very, very diverse, and so it is very difficult to extract one single conclusion about the good and the bad of these policies. No?
There are mainly three factors that shape the outcome of local content policies. I would say first, the history of the sector in the country, and second, government regulation and policies, and third, the collaboration with the private sector. So what do we mean by that? The history of the sector is obviously important because if you compare and contrast Latin America with Africa, especially sort of like the new producers in East Africa, there's a huge difference in the time that the sector has been around. So Latin American countries like Trinidad and Tobago had a history of more than 100 years of oil extraction, whereas some countries like Kenya, from what I know, only recently discovered their oil resources. So obviously they don't have the skills, sort of like the expertise yet, so they have to build that, and that also has to lower sort of like their expectations of what is actually achievable in terms of content. Which brings me to the second point, which is government regulation. So you really have to look for like a targeted approach that is specific to the country, meaning that the policy targets are not too high, which was, for example, the case in Brazil, which was recently got a lot of bad news for the associated problems. Because what happens if the goal is too high? Then people might just pay somebody in order to not reach the goal because it's just simply not feasible. And then obviously if it's too low, then it doesn't really create any additional benefit. So you really have to find like the sweet spot in the individual country. And to do so, you have to take an assessment of the country's initial conditions. So, for example, through a demand analysis, what is actually going to be procured by the multinational companies, and where are opportunities for local sourcing? And that brings me to the third point, which is collaboration with the private sector. So the government cannot, or it's probably not going to work out if the government just says you have to employ X amount of local people and procure a Y percentage of local goods. If the government doesn't help the private sector to achieve these goals, it's most certainly doomed to fail. So you have to the government has to engage in terms of like supplier development, provide access to finance, require the multinational companies to unbundle their contracts, tell the local suppliers where the opportunities are so that they're actually aware, which they might not be, help them attain the international health and environmental and safety standards, which especially in the oil and gas industry are very high. So unless those requirements are met, the multinational companies are hardly going to collaborate with local suppliers because it's just too much of a risk. Also, quality is very important. So you have to do a gap analysis in terms of what is the current level of capacity and capability that these local suppliers have, and also local employees, and then what is feasible within the given amount of time that you can bridge in terms of capacity building and helping out these people.